when the war ends without the ability to eliminate Iran and the Axis, I believe that will mark the beginning of the Israeli occupation entity's downward trajectory, because it's not fulfilling its functional role of being able to subdue these very movements. And then if you also consider the global support for Israel completely weakening, the West may come to see it as easier and better to deal with a real power through which it can secure as many of its interests as possible, rather than maintaining an explosive and unstable situation in such an important region that's threatening all its interests. So even if we look at the size of the protests in the West and the reversal of public opinion, which I believe it's literally unprecedented. The reversal of public opinion with regards to Gaza is like unlike anything I've ever seen. And that's very evident upon the new generation, who have taken a position different to the older generation. And so when the general situation does not tolerate Israel, that no longer serves the Western Empire's interests.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. I'm Ileana Chan, and this week I'm really happy to welcome back Batool Subeiti. Batool is a Lebanese British energy engineer and political analyst based in London. Welcome back to Global Majority for Peace.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure, Ileana.
So we've got a lot to cover today. I do want to say to people watching this, the first part will be on YouTube, the full episode on Patreon. We're just trying to diversify our platforms just in case something happens to the YouTube channel. So please become a patron on that Patreon. And also tomorrow we will have an audio as well. So it will be on Patreon and Spotify and Amazon Music. Okay, so the 2026 National Defense Strategy was just released. So we're going to be talking about this in the first question, but to sort of give context to what our interview was last time you were on, it was just after, about a month after the 12-day war when Israel attacked Iran. But now we're sort of seeing like, I can't do math, but 7 or 8 months on pretty much the same trajectory, I think, but an expansion of US imperialist agenda in the region, but not a shift, I would say, not a pivot. It doesn't seem like. Now, the National Defense Strategy was released on the 23rd of January, and I'm going to quote from the Iran section. President Trump has consistently made clear that Iran will not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. And with Operation Midnight Hammer, he showed that he follows through on his word decisively. No other military in the world could have executed an operation of such scale, complexity, and consequence as Operation Midnight Hammer. And further on, he says, Iran's axis of resistance is similarly devastated. Israeli operations have left Hezbollah and Hamas severely degraded. What is your assessment of the reality from, well, the reality? I could probably just stop there.
Absolutely. I just echo what you started off with, and that was that American imperialism essentially remains as it's always been in terms of its arrogance, its tyranny, its oppression. Those characteristics don't change. It was like that in the past. It remains so today. But the only difference I'd say is now with Trump, it's become so strikingly blatant that he like sits atop the throne of the world, and he has this kind of authority that does not accept criticism, objection, or challenge. So in his classification of enemies, the enemy must either come over to his side or to be destroyed. And with this mentality, he lives in a state of intoxication with this idea of victory, and an intoxication of the fact that no one objects to him and no one tells him no. And so the objective in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran with Operation Midnight Hammer was not to target nuclear program per se. That is the title and the excuse used to project Iran as a threat. The objective from everything that's happening to Iran is its surrender. That's something that Trump openly has stated. He said this last year during the June 2025 war, that he wants total surrender from Iran. And so if they curb Iran's nuclear potential, they consider this to be a sign of surrender. So one could say that Trump achieved a symbolic victory in Operation Midnight Hammer. In reality, though, as we said, Trump was trying in every way to lead Iran towards surrender. It didn't surrender, of course, after the American bombing of the nuclear sites. And so from America's perspective, it will try a higher dose. So now we're at a stage where, after what America has achieved in Venezuela with Maduro's kidnapping, essentially he wants to repeat this same experience in Iran in a similar way in terms of removing the supreme leader. And this is something that he has stated within Truth Social as well, that the supreme leader needs to be removed, even though, of course, for analysts or even just lay people, it's clear that the circumstances are fundamentally different. And what was achieved in Venezuela cannot be achieved in Iran. When we talk about Iran, we're talking about a very strong civilization, a very strong culture, deeply rooted institutions. It's a nation that rallies around its leadership. Who has protected the revolution and the state of Iran other than the nation and the public for these past 4.5 decades? So just to go to your second part of your question about the axis of resistance, yes, of course, America in its hubris believes that they struck the axis of resistance, and that the resistance in Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and the rest of the axis also in Yemen and Iraq has weakened and fallen apart. But I would say the opposite is actually true. And I'd say that, especially as a Lebanese who's seen people on the ground and been to Lebanon several times after the striking open war last year, on the surface, yes, it appears that way. It appears that, and it's actually true, that the resistance has been weakened in terms of its logistical and technical capability, yes. Its ability to confront, especially we're seeing the Lebanese resistance has completely adhered to the ceasefire terms. There is a shortage of conventional weapons and supplies, especially in light of Syria's downfall, the former government's downfall. And no one argues with the technological superiority of the Israeli occupation entity in America. That's always out of the question in terms of its precision. But at a deeper level, the mere will to resist, the mere steadfastness in principles, the strengthening of those principles that happens during war places, I believe, it in a stronger position and places the resistance in a state that is capable of rebuilding itself many times over what it once was. Because what's happened now is the nurturing environment of the resistance, and that is the people that support the resistance, has never at any time been as determined and steadfast in its commitment to the path of resistance as it is today. So, for example, the residents of the destroyed border villages in South Lebanon, as we speak, they're living in caravans instead of homes that they can't afford to build. Despite everything, though, their movement and their life hasn't stopped. They continue to revive their areas to harvest their crops, and they're effectively clinging onto their land. And so this kind of steadfastness and attachment to their land, this deep sense of belonging, would not exist without their commitment to the cause and adherence to the path. And those who live among them can deeply sense how much they are connected to their land and understand how the concept of resistance has now transformed into a way of life. So I would argue that this is actually the most important result of this war, of the Al-Aqsa flood for the past 2 years, is that when someone looks at an entity like Lebanon, looks at destroyed border villages and sees this level of sympathy for the resistance amongst the resistance's community, the lay people, despite the lack of any possibility of reconstruction, this is proof that the resistance is not defeated if the will of the people is not defeated. You know, this is a resistance that is strong with its environment, strong with its people, strong with its principles. And I believe this is the most important element. And if this element falls, then you can literally consider the cause finished. As for the technical means, those things come and go. Yes, they may have destroyed many of the means, but within the spirit, the means can be regained. And this is what the Israeli occupation entity fears the most, because Israel would not be doing what it's doing today if it believed that the resistance was weaker and unable to respond. And that's in terms of attacking Lebanon literally every day. There is a violation of the ceasefire and some sort of assassination. And also now another important point is that the resistance is capable of recruiting. whether in Lebanon or in Gaza, many times more than it was previously able to do so. And that is because of the exposure and the unveiling of their enemy to such an extent that resistance is no longer seen as a luxury option, but an obligatory means to survive for those who didn't even previously believe or acknowledge it to that level. So Israel's assassinations day on day in Lebanon is proof that it fears to a large extent the readiness of resistance. And for this reason, it continues to pursue the resistance in Lebanon and continues to threaten with war. And I believe this is also the path by extension that Iran is following, and all parties for that matter in the axis of resistance. If Trump at the head of imperialism thinks he can force them to kneel, he won't succeed. And that's why someone like Trump thinks in terms of precise surgical operations that strike like a thunderbolt, expecting them to ignite fires and tremors that will bring the situation to an end. It's like that quick wins. But he won't be able to do that because that does not work with the Iranian case, nor with the case of the Axis, nor with any case in the world that embraces the principles of liberation as a creed. In the case of Iran, that's considered as part of its true Islamic faith and identity as an Islamic republic, which I believe makes it free through a belief for which it is willing to sacrifice, and its people have proven that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you're raising about the idea of the resistance being a matter of survival now. It's not just ideology, it's necessity. Because I think what we're looking at in the US as well is just there's a lot of propaganda, which is always the case, but it seems like the marketing of the operations, the actions on the ground really pale in comparison. Now there's such a wide gap. It seems like I really want to make sure that I'm not underestimating in any way the incredible destructive nature of US imperialism or downplaying the dangerous times that we're in. But when we look at, for example, the US kidnapping of Maduro and the attempted regime change in Venezuela, at the time when news broke that President Maduro was kidnapped, people really feared that Venezuela would be the next Iraq. They really did think that this would be the beginning of the Iraq War, and it really seemed like they were reporting as if this was a successful regime change. They toppled the government, etc. And now a few weeks on, that doesn't seem to be the case. The Venezuela regime, it still seems to be intact. Granted, it is a huge blow, and it's a very scary thing to have happened, but it certainly was not, the reality doesn't seem to be what it was reported. Now, a few days ago, Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard issued a warning against Trump that they're more ready than ever and their finger is on the trigger. And this is while US warships head towards the Middle East. Do you think that my rambling assessment that perhaps this is sort of, it signals kind of like a change in US military capacity or capability? Do you think that this is really the case here? And what do you think this means for Iran?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in Venezuela, the situation was different. Venezuela was subdued, as you mentioned very rightly so, simply by abducting the president. And they brought in his deputy, Delcy Rodriguez. The presidency, an institution, of course, that followed the Bolivarian anti-American imperialist state, came to take its orders from Trump or others outside the country and to implement their plans. Essentially, they want to repeat the Venezuelan experiment in Iran. So I don't think it's the case that they want to turn Venezuela into another Iran. Rather, they want to turn Iran into another Venezuela, in the sense that, similarly to what they did in Venezuela, they want to bring down the leadership. They want to bring down Sayyid Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader. And then whoever comes after is told, either you do what we want or we will make you follow your predecessor. That is, we'll kill you. Those were actually the words of Trump towards Delcy Rodriguez. He literally threatened her, like, we would do to you worse than we did to Maduro, which could literally be taken as an assassination threat. This is an approach, I believe, that will not succeed in the case of Iran, because we're talking about very deeply rooted institutions within the Islamic Republic that are very self-sufficient. And as we've mentioned, that word survival comes into mind because Iran was a country that since 1979 has completely been embargoed and besieged by the whole world to bring down this revolution, to essentially topple it. These institutions, however, the only sense of support that they have is that they are popular and the nation is ideologically orientated towards it. That is that they won't surrender and they'll fight until the very end. So no enemy, no matter how powerful, can subdue them. In terms of military capabilities, the size of US forces in the region, even under maximum pressure, I believe is insufficient to topple a country like Iran through air or naval strikes, no matter how many bombs they drop from the sky. And I believe also a ground invasion is impossible. And we shouldn't also forget that all sources of American power are within the range of the Iranian weapons. Iran's ability to respond by targeting US bases is very important to consider, given the number of US bases abroad, some of which were evacuated as soon as the strike was announced some weeks ago. So while the presence of US forces is a strength when they control territory, it actually becomes a weakness when they can be targeted and harmed. So when a state attacks a country the size of Iran, regardless of the scale of destruction or disruption that could be inflicted on Iran's electronic systems, its infrastructure, its jamming systems, Iran, I believe, is able to overcome this and it won't collapse. And so an operation aimed at overthrowing the system, as we've mentioned, it can't be naval, it can't be aerial. If it involves a ground invasion, it moves from being impossible to outright inconceivable, given the existing realities, unless in one case, and that's if America decides to use absolutely prohibited weapons of mass destruction, essentially, the nuclear option, which would scramble the cards and create a situation unlivable and contrary ultimately to US interests after such a massive strike, especially since Iran, in that case, would not have been a real threatening party. Pretext of intervention to protect protesters. I mean, that's the latest one after Trump claimed victory through Operation Midnight Hammer. He can't use the same argument or reasoning of we need to strike the nuclear capabilities. So protecting protesters does not justify a response of this magnitude or the use of weapons of mass destruction. And also the cost of war is the second issue. If the cost exceeds the profit, and Trump is a very profit business orientated kind of guy, it's not recommended to wage such a war when the cost outweighs the results. So unlike the war that took place last year, which lasted 12 days, that was the prelude to an attempted military strike intended to prepare the grounds for internal movements. That's what it was last year. Last year it was let's strike, and then once we strike, we'll cause so much havoc and commotion that we'll prepare the grounds for the people to basically revolt against the system. But of course, the opposite happened. And so now, in our case right now, there is the preempted internal movements instead of carrying out a possible strike, because during the war last year, the Iranian public rallied around the leadership in the face of the external threat. So now it's the opposite. The protest movement has materialized through the rioters to be exploited and to pave the way for external intervention. So the postponement of the American strike, that everyone was waiting for that golden moment for America to strike, and Iran shut its airspace effectively. All civilian planes couldn't go and come during that one day. The postponement of that strike came after it became clear to America that the protests had really failed, making the mission even more difficult. And the size of the US forces that were present in the region then was limited. So additional forces were sent to the region to reinforcement. And now you have the warships, the Abraham Lincoln, that's come and crossed into the region now. So I believe right now America's waiting for the appropriate intelligence moment that would allow them to achieve really precise targets, perhaps to strike the leader of the Islamic Republic. So they would resort to this option in their assessment because they would want to avoid a comprehensive war that definitely won't be in their interests.
That's interesting. Can you expand a little bit more on these protests? Because, of course, the reports that we're getting in Western media, large-scale anti-government protests, and we're getting reports of death tolls estimating from 5,000 to 17,000. I've heard that on the higher end. And then, of course, it resulted in extensive internet shutdowns. Obviously, with this type of unanimous Western media coverage, it definitely suggests some sort of manufactured color revolution. But can you give us your assessment of what the actual situation is on the ground?
Yeah. So in this round, things did begin with legitimate demands and protests. But of course, it needs to be mentioned over here that those very protests were caused by direct harsh conditions imposed by the West, particularly over Christmas. There was very high inflation. This was after Western companies manipulated the currency exchange abroad to create the grounds for internal protesting that could then morph into chaos and rioting, as we ended up seeing. So the currency within Iran, the Tuman, dropped by around 40% 30 to 40% were the estimates. And just to put some historical context, for 47 years, America have imposed sieges, they've boycotted, they've punished, and they've created extremely difficult economic conditions. And they also impose sanctions on anyone who deals with Iran as part of the embargo. So within this approach, it's undeniable but that very harsh economic realities are created. I'd say it's almost miraculous that Iran has survived throughout all these previous periods of sieges, 47 years of sanctions, whilst adapting to them and building its own self-reliant capabilities across various fields. And so this situation naturally creates a degree of internal discontent because the sanctions place heavy burdens on ordinary people. And so then it's very natural for this discontent to sometimes be expressed through demonstrations and protests. That, may I just clarify, we're not calling for the dismantlement of the Islamic Republic, but for officials to do something about the economic situation. So to be clear, the protests never reached the stage of a revolution, as the West is making it out to be. As you rightly mentioned in the question, external elements did enter into it. If we just look at the acts of violence that occurred against Iranian institutions, who, by the way, Trump did come out and tell the Iranian people, like, reclaim your institutions, capture them. Mike Pompeo tweeted saying, for every Iranian protester, he means rioter, there is a Mossad agent on the ground. These attacks against the Iranian institutions also happened against not just civilians, but against police forces. Some of them were stabbed, decapitated, burnt alive. So we're talking about reaching the points of beheadings. That's obviously outside the scope of protest demands when it reaches to this kind of behavior. And that in and of itself, this extremism, this ISIS-style extremism, indicates external intervention and agendas being imposed. And so it's been very clear that the Zionist entities intervening, America's intervening, Europe is intervening, because also, despite the outward threats made by someone like Mike Pompeo, we've seen that Trump is threatening to bomb Iran. Is this a policy that the United States or Europe applies towards the entire world? Or is it directed specifically against Iran? You had Israeli Channel 14 reporting during the riots that foreign actors are arming the protesters in Iran with live firearms, which is the reason for the hundreds of regime personnel killed. An Israeli commentator, to be specific, Tamir Morag, tweeted that everyone is free to guess who is behind arming these rioters. So since when have Western powers not intervened for Iran for this to be a shock for some? And it's happened many times where Western intelligence agencies and services of the Zionist entity intervene through essential sleeper cells, which are numerous and widespread, that they activate all at once. They receive their funding and their weapons to the extent that they've become very organized institutions of collaboration and linkage with foreign intelligence services. If one just looks at MEK, for example, that has its headquarters in Albania. And of course, the West conspired with the MEK, who supported Saddam Hussein during the invasion of Iran during the 80s. These groups insert themselves into the protests and they carry out acts of violence. And ultimately, the goal of these riots was to overthrow the system and to seize power. But they failed in this. And so that's important to mention. Now, obviously, when horrific acts of violence occurs, killings, beheadings, stabbings, executions at point blank range against protesters and demonstrators and police officers, casualties occur in all of this. So the number is not the main issue. But in this context, it is a real war that's being waged on Iran. These deaths are then exploited to suggest the possibility of foreign intervention from the West to rescue a situation that very sinisterly the West have themselves created, initially through sanctions, boycotts, and punishments. The second layer is them moving on to hijack the protesters that are very legitimate, to market their narrative, and to get all this bloodshed unleashed through a kind of civil war in Iran through their writers, and then to proceed with military intervention. So you can see all the layers of sinisterism from the West. And so the entity, the Israeli occupation entity, and the Americans, of course, they've come to the conviction that the mastermind of the axis of resistance, that is Iran, what they consider the head of the snake, must be struck and eliminated decisively, and that the system must be removed. So this is really what they are pursuing. But what actually happened as a result of these riots, similar to half a year ago in the June 2025 war, the Iranian nation again rallied around its leadership even more because these objectives were early on exposed. And because the Iranians are smart people, they don't want to enter the world of chaos that engulfed neighboring regions and countries when the Americans intervened in popular will and created widespread disorder throughout the region. The Iranian people refused to be led into the chaos, like the chaos that now dominates the surrounding region. And even, I just want to make this point, if we look at those who legitimately protest, we talk about the labor unions who saw the attempted hijack of the labor movement, they instantly made public announcements denouncing foreign manipulation of the protests. So it's important to mention that the Iranian people understand, particularly the leaders of the working class movements that are seeking genuine reform, they know that a country's sovereignty is an important precondition to advancing your struggle, and that if Iran falls to the Western capital, then this shall subjugate its people to a far greater power. So if we want to weaken imperialism, it's fundamental to the working class struggle for liberation in Iran. So just to very well conclude on this point, the two most important factors behind the failure of the latest, as you mentioned and characterized it as the color revolution, latest attempt to overthrow the system, were one is quite technical, and that's the main surprise, and that was disabling Starlink the Starlink internet, and acting intelligently in managing confrontations with sabotage elements. This was a very unexpected, decisive factor, and the riots literally died down after the coordination factor was removed. They were at their peak on Thursday and Friday, and then it just died down on Saturday. So the even more important factor than this, though, as I mentioned, were the near universal popular mobilization into the streets. This made the world realize that this state is strong through its institutions, through its people, and that its people are the ones that protect the state. And so if the majority of Iranians were against the Islamic Republic as a system, and this is what we get told in the West, and if we look at the world is not only supporting the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, but it's punishing the whole population. It's punishing the Iranians through sanctions imposed as a result of the system in place, then I believe we would have seen Iran's overthrow if we're saying that the majority of the people were not fond of it. In the same way that this same people in 1979, the majority of the Iranians overthrew the Shah of Iran. And may I add, they paid a heavy price for it. So it's not like the Iranians are scared of the price to pay for overthrowing an oppressive regime. They paid that price in 1979 against all the odds, against all the superpowers of the world at the time, and they endured an 8-year-long war. So rest assured, if the majority of the Iranians want to see a complete regime change, they themselves would let go of support for the system. They won't heed the call of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, when he makes a lecture or he makes a speech and he asks the Iranian people to show unity. You get millions and millions of Iranians in all provinces within the country coming out and supporting the system and the revolution. So the Iranian people should not be underestimated.
It's really interesting. It just makes me wonder, and I think so here I'm going to be exposing some of my ignorance about Iran. I guess my question is, why was Starlink being used in Iran when you have 49 years of sanctions and really external interference in many different ways? And also, does Iran have a sort of like an internet firewall type of thing like China has, where they've cut off like Google, Meta, basically foreign companies that refuse to adhere to Chinese regulations and law?
Yeah, so of course, Iran has the ability to shut off the domestic internet satellite, the Wi-Fi and the mobile internet networks, but Starlink is external to that. The idea is you have an independent system like Starlink that could enable connection for people that want to connect to it. That's outside the scope of control of the Iranian government. So the biggest shocker of all was the fact that Iran was able to disable Starlink. Of course, in this situation, Iran would want to shut down the internet in such a sensitive time when it knows that it is this coordination internally between the rioters and their leaders, and with those externally who are giving them the orders, that is what is causing these riots. So in these sensitive situations, you would expect the internet to basically die down. It's contrary to what the West was trying to claim, that the system wanted to basically black out so that they can commit atrocities. It's actually the complete opposite. It's through blacking out the internet that they were able to not allow the rioters to coordinate. And then anyone who was actually actively connecting to Starlink, then the Iranians were able to track and to monitor who those individuals were. And of course, those were Mossad agents and considered traitors within the country who were subject to treason laws. So the Iranians were able to capture essentially those sleeper cells that were activated and were able to track them down. And there were thousands that were essentially arrested and charged under that. And yeah, to answer the second part of your question, yes, the internet within Iran isn't the most affordable in terms of social media. So you'd expect to see, for example, Instagram, X, like you've mentioned, Meta, Facebook, those you would require VPN to basically access it. So the vast majority of Iranians do have VPN and can bypass that. But again, it's the security situation of a country that is completely besieged. And you have to consider the extent of the strength of the soft war. And that's something that I believe America has the upper hand in and cannot overcome countries like Russia, like China, even like the Islamic Republic of Iran. The soft power that it has, the power of projection, the power of advertising, the power of the media, of manipulating hearts and minds. So this is part of like a strategy of self-preservation, essentially, and that's to limit exposure to Western content. But again, that's something that could easily be bypassed by the average person that's living there through just a simple VPN connection.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.